Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. Well, I've been promising a couple of videos on the contents of Have Spell Will Travel. Because the book is an anthology, it's very hard to talk about it as a unit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down what you could think of as the major thematic elements piece by piece. To do that, I'm going to look at the stories that encompass those basic elements. And I'm going to begin with the elements that are introduced first in the first couple of stories that I wrote. Now, it's worth pointing out that Roy Harper is not actually where everything began. He was kind of a character that I came up with as I was working on another story. Like a lot of authors, I have a tendency to put a lot of thought and world building into a thing before I actually tell a story there. I think that gives a world and the characters more of a lived-in feel, a sense that you have stepped into an ongoing situation, rather than that the characters and the world they inhabit simply poofed into existence when you cracked open a book. As such, Roy was conceived as a group of survivors of a dreadful siege that takes place in the Colombian West about 7 or 8 years before the beginning of most of the stories recorded in Have Spell Will Travel. Conceptually, this created a reputation for Roy, which is why he is presented as an already famous character with a reputation as a monster hunter and a mercenary, rather than as a character who is making his way in the world already. With that said, there was still a need to present the character to the audience, because a person is more than just their reputation and their previous achievements. The story of Fire Spinner is the first Roy Harper adventure I wrote, and it was structured to introduce all the elements of the character that I thought would be important to him going forward. So, in Fire Spinner, we see Roy going out to the northwest to do a favor for an old friend, somebody he knew when he was in the army. Every so often, a tree will pull up its roots, walk into town, and attack people, something Roy himself experiences as he gets off the SkyTrain. One of these attacks has left a man dead and kidnapped one of the man's twin sons. The Guild of Woodsmen want to ensure their woodcutters can work safely. The widow wants her son back. And Roy, well, he finds out that an enemy officer who disappeared at the end of the last war, taking a stack of magical weapons with him, may be looking to add another catastrophic artifact of magic power to his arsenal. Whether the situation is what it appears to be on the surface or is something a little bit deeper, Roy will have to sort it all out and make sure everyone gets what's coming to him. Fire Spinner was a story to introduce Roy and the world, but also a lot of the thematic elements to it. The history of the Colombian West is heavily influenced by an event called the Lakeshire War. If you want to know more about that, I have a whole playlist that kind of lays out the details there. The link is down below in the description. But the purpose of the Lakeshire War was to make it clear that the Colombian West is an inflection point. It is where the past of Colombia goes to become the future. As odd as that sounds, it's a story about people who are recovering from their last great labor and trying to decide what their next great struggle is going to be. That is why I chose to have a major enemy general as a figure in the very first story. He's not a far distant obstacle for Roy to overcome, but rather a reminder of what Roy has already done and what he has to think about as he decides where he's going to go next. It also introduces Roy's general modus operandi and lets us see a part of the West that most people don't think of. There were a ton of lumber camps in the American West as well, but it's not something people really talk about because the cowboys just seem to grab so much of the imagination for reasons that I do understand. The second story in the book is a direct sequel to the first. It's called Night Train to Hardwick, and when Fire Spinner ends, Roy is about to get on a train leaving town, and Night Train to Hardwick is that train ride, something that proves to be a lot more trying than Roy was expecting it to be. It turns out Roy has wound up on a haunted train, and he has to figure out why there are ghosts all through it. Now, this story still has some elements of the past, most notably embodied in the form of the ghosts themselves, a couple of which it turns out Roy knew personally. However, in addition to presenting ghosts of the past, it's an opportunity to introduce a number of characters I intend to keep around Roy for most of the stories I tell about him. Brandon and Cassandra Fairchild are visitors from the distant land of Avalon, sent to the Columbian West in an effort to rediscover lost texts brought over by the original Druids. The Fairchilds have powerful gifts of their own, and no one has any interest in allowing ghosts to run rampant across the train, no telling what kind of trouble that could bring, so they assist Roy in tamping down on the problem. I like to think of Night Train to Hardwick as a promise of what the rest of the series is going to be. Fire Spinner was an introduction to the series, but it was also a little more grandiose than I really wanted every story about Roy to be. Roy is supposed to be kind of an everyday problem solver kind of a character, not someone who is constantly deciding the fates of many with his actions. Yes, many people will depend on him, but it's not always at the level of what takes place in Fire Spinner. I like to think of these first two novellas as a highly condensed vision for a Roy Harper adventure. Not everything that takes place in them is going to take place in every adventure, and some adventures might go outside the confines of the stakes and the themes that you see in those two stories. But on the whole, the backbone of what I want to write about when I write a Roy Harper story is encapsulated in those two novellas. By the same token, they were the first two stories I wrote about the character. And you might say every story that I intend to write about Roy Harper is going to be based on something you've already seen in those two narratives. Now I'm going to develop it, and the character will grow, and he will meet other people that will give new insight into the world and the man himself, but the intention is to continue to play on these basic themes. Things like responsibility, helping your friends, and balancing your obligations to the past and to the future. At the same time, they take place in very exotic locales, because I don't really want Roy to be a sedentary character. I want him to constantly show up in different places. It is one of my goals to have every story take place in a different venue, at least for the bulk of it. Perhaps we'll briefly revisit other locations. But I am working in the medium of prose, and I don't feel like I gain anything by having a specific constant touchstone where every story goes back to, a lair or a headquarters. Roy does have a house and a place he lives with, characters he lives with, but they aren't going to be a huge focus on him. His job is to go to other places and sort out the problems he finds there. So the first two stories in particular, I kept that in mind. Interestingly enough, the third story I originally had in mind would go back to Roy's headquarters, and we would spend a little time there getting to know the character in his natural element, so to speak. But I decided to delay that because, as I said, I don't really want Roy's headquarters, Oakhart Manor, to be a centerpiece of the story. It's more like the place where other people can find him. So I chose to push that back and save that for a later installment. The other two novellas in Have Spell Will Travel are more about what Roy does right now. We see him doing the things that have made his reputation and keep a roof over his head. So that is what I will be discussing in the next installment of this video series when we discuss the stories Fire and Gold and A Candle in the Wind. In the meantime, if what you've heard sounds appealing to you, you can pick up Have Spell Will Travel by using the link down in the description below. If you've already read the book, by all means, please let me know what you thought of it down in the comments. While you're at it, there's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.